The sound of my father's laughter still haunts me. Not the warm, loving laughter I remembered from childhood, but the cold, dismissive laughter that followed the words that shattered my world. Zara's always been a burden. Now she thinks she deserves a mansion. I was standing just around the corner at our family barbecue, holding a pitcher of sweet tea, when I heard him tell his brothers what he really thought of me. 26 years old, working double shifts as a nurse to keep our household running, living in the house my grandmother left me, and I was the burden. My name is Zara Williams, and that $1.2 million house my grandmother left me was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it became the stage for the most devastating betrayal of my life. Because while my father was calling me a burden, he was also secretly stealing my home right from under me. What happened next? Well, let's just say that when someone calls you a burden long enough, you start believing maybe it's time to lift that weight off their shoulders. Permanently. 3 months after that barbecue, I stood in an empty house, my house, watching my father's face turn ashen as he realized his key no longer worked. The moving trucks were gone. The buyers had closed. And my note on the kitchen counter simply read, "Surprise. The burden just sold the house you thought was yours." But that wasn't even the best part. See, while he was busy calling me deadweight, my father had been committing felonies to steal my inheritance. And when the FBI showed up at his door with handcuffs, that's when he learned what a real burden feels like. Before I tell you how I went from being the family disappointment to watching my own father get arrested for fraud, and how I turned his biggest insult into his worst nightmare, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and smash that like button if you've ever had family members who treated your success like it belonged to them. Because trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why calling me a burden became the most expensive mistake my father ever made. And why that family barbecue was the last time anyone in my family ever questioned what I deserved. But to understand how sweet my revenge was, you need to know how deep this betrayal went. You need to see how a father could look his daughter in the eye every single day while plotting to steal everything her grandmother left her. Because this isn't just about selling a house. This is about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from. To understand how my father could betray me so completely, you need to know what my life looked like before everything fell apart. Picture this, a beautiful colonial house in Decatur, Georgia, with white columns and a wraparound porch that my grandmother had lovingly maintained for 40 years. From the outside, we looked like the perfect blended family making the best of a difficult situation. My grandmother, Mama Rose, had been my world. When my mother died in a car accident when I was 8, Mama Rose stepped in without hesitation. She raised me in that house, teaching me about strength, independence, and never letting anyone make you feel small. "Baby girl," she'd tell me while we worked in her garden, "your worth isn't determined by what other people can take from you. It's determined by what you refuse to give up." Mama Rose had been a smart woman who'd worked as a school principal for 30 years and invested wisely in real estate. By the time she passed from cancer when I was 23, that house was worth over $1 million, and she'd made sure every legal document was crystal clear. Everything went to me. But life has a way of complicating even the clearest intentions. My father, Marcus Williams, had remarried 2 years after my mother's death to a woman named Denise who came with 2 teenage children of her own, my step-siblings Jamal and Keisha. For the most part, we'd all gotten along, though I'd always felt like an outsider looking in on their tight-knit unit. When Mama Rose died and left me the house, I was devastated and completely overwhelmed. I was working as a registered nurse at Grady Hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts and barely keeping my head above water emotionally. The last thing I wanted was to live alone in that big house filled with memories. So when Dad suggested that he, Denise, and my step-siblings move in to help me manage the property and provide emotional support, it seemed like a blessing. "Family takes care of family," he said, wrapping me in what felt like the first genuine hug he'd given me since Mom died. "You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone." That word, burden, should have been a red flag. But at 23, grieving and exhausted, I heard it as compassion. They moved in gradually. First, Dad started handling the complicated financial stuff, property taxes, insurance, maintenance scheduling. "You're working so hard, baby girl," he'd say. "Let your old man take care of the business side so you can focus on healing people." Denise took over the household management, redecorating rooms and making the space feel more like home for everyone. She was actually good at it, and I appreciated coming home to a house that felt warm and lived in rather than like a museum of memories. Jamal and Keisha were in their late teens then, and they treated the house like teenagers treat any house, as their natural habitat. They claimed bedrooms, filled the garage with their cars, and invited friends over for pool parties and study sessions. For almost 2 years, it worked. Or at least, I thought it worked. I was making good money as a nurse, easily covering the mortgage, utilities, and household expenses. Dad handled the paperwork, Denise managed the day-to-day operations, and I had a family again. Every Sunday, we'd have big dinners on the back porch, and Dad would grill while talking about his plans to expand his construction business. "This house is going to be our foundation," he'd say, gesturing toward the property with his beer bottle. Mama Rose knew what she was doing when she kept it in the family. Kept it in the family. Not left it to Zara. Not gave Zara this gift. Kept it in the family, like it belonged to all of us equally. I should have been paying attention to his language. I should have been asking more questions about the paperwork he was handling. I should have noticed that whenever people asked about the house, Dad would smile and say, "We inherited it," rather than "Zara inherited it." But I was working 60-hour weeks, exhausted from saving lives at the hospital, and just grateful to have a family that seemed to love and support me. I had no idea that behind the Sunday dinners and family game nights, my father was systematically positioning himself to steal everything Mama Rose had left me. I had no idea that his help with the paperwork was actually a carefully orchestrated plan to make himself the legal owner of my inheritance. And I definitely had no idea that in his mind, I wasn't his daughter benefiting from family support, I was a burden he was planning to eliminate. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Because what I'm about to tell you is how family financial abuse works. It's not one big theft, it's 1,000 small takeovers that happen so gradually you don't notice until it's too late. It started with Dad's helpful suggestions about the house. Little things that seemed reasonable coming from someone with construction experience. "You know, Zara, this roof is going to need work in the next few years," he'd say, running his hands along the gutters. "I've got a guy who can give us a good deal, but we should probably set up a house account so I can handle these repairs when you're at work." Us. We. Our house. The language shift was so subtle I didn't even notice it happening. Within 6 months of moving in, Dad had convinced me to add his name to the house bank account for emergencies. When the water heater broke during one of my night shifts, he said he needed access to handle the repair immediately. It made sense. I trusted him. That was my first mistake. The changes escalated quickly after that. Denise started referring to various rooms as hers. The sunroom became my craft room, the basement became my exercise space. When I mentioned wanting to convert the guest room into a home office, she frowned. "But that's where my mother stays when she visits," she said. "We can't just change things without discussing it as a family." As a family. Like her mother's comfort in my house was more important than my actual needs in my own home. But the most insidious changes were the financial ones. Dad started bringing me thick stacks of papers to sign. Insurance updates, he'd explain. Property tax reassessments. Utility account changes. Boring stuff, but it needs your signature since you're the owner. I was working 12-hour shifts, coming home exhausted, and he'd catch me right as I walked in the door. "Just need you to sign here, here, and here, baby girl. I've already read through everything." I signed whatever he put in front of me. He was my father. He was helping me. Why would I question him? That was my second mistake. By the end of the first year, I started noticing that I never saw any of the financial documents anymore. When I asked about property tax bills or insurance statements, Dad would wave dismissively. "Don't worry about all that paperwork," he'd say. "I've got everything organized in my office. You focus on your patients, I'll handle the business side." His office. In my house. Where all the documents about my property were kept, and I wasn't invited to see them. The family dynamic started shifting too. During dinner conversations, Dad would make offhand comments about our investment and building equity in the property. When his friends came over for poker nights, I'd overhear him talking about his house and the improvements he was making. "Marcus has really done well for himself," I heard his friend Tommy say one evening. "That's a beautiful house you've got." "Thanks, man," Dad replied. "It's been a lot of work, but we're building something solid here." He was taking credit for my inheritance, and I was too exhausted and trusting to call him out on it. The breaking point should have been when Denise started making major decorating decisions without consulting me. She replaced Mama Rose's antique furniture with modern pieces, painted over the floral wallpaper my grandmother had loved, and even got rid of Mama Rose's china cabinet. It was looking so dated, she explained when I came home to find it gone. "This house needs to feel current, not like a museum." When I protested, Dad stepped in with that patronizing tone I was starting to hate. "Zara, honey, Denise is just trying to make this feel like home for everyone. Change is hard, but sometimes it's necessary. Home for everyone. Not home for me. Not my home that I was graciously sharing. Home for everyone, like I was just another resident with equal say in decisions about my own property." The financial red flags should have been impossible to ignore. Despite making good money as a nurse, I was constantly struggling to cover household expenses. The mortgage, utilities, groceries, repairs, somehow everything cost more than it should have. "Running a house this size is expensive," Dad would say when I mentioned the financial strain. "But don't worry, we're all contributing. It's an investment in our family's future." Contributing how? I was the only one with a steady paycheck. Dad's construction business was between projects more often than not. Denise worked part-time at a retail store. Jamal and Keisha were in community college. But whenever I tried to sit down and go through the actual numbers, Dad would get defensive. "Are you questioning my financial management?" he'd ask, his voice taking on an edge that reminded me uncomfortably of how he used to speak to my mother when he was angry. "I've been handling money since before you were born, Zara. Trust me to take care of our family. Our family. Our house. Our investment." I was slowly being erased from ownership of my own inheritance, and I was too busy working to save lives to notice that my own father was killing my financial future. But that was nothing compared to what I discovered was happening behind closed doors. Because while I was working night shifts at the hospital, thinking my family was taking care of my home, they were actually taking care of themselves to everything Mama Rose had left me. And the worst part? They were doing it all with my own signature. The conversation that shattered my world happened on Memorial Day weekend, 2023. I remember the exact date because it was the day I learned that the people you trust the most can be the ones plotting your destruction with surgical precision. We were hosting our annual family barbecue, an event Dad had started the year after they moved in, claiming it was important to show the community what a strong family looks like. The backyard was filled with Dad's brothers, their wives, some neighbors, and a few of his construction buddies. The smell of barbecue filled the air, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. I had just finished my third consecutive 12-hour shift at the hospital and was exhausted, but Dad had insisted I needed to be there. "This is about family unity," he'd said. "People need to see us all together." I should have paid attention to that phrasing too. I was in the kitchen refilling the pitcher of sweet tea when I heard Dad's voice carrying from the back porch where he was standing with his brothers, Uncle Kevin and Uncle Jerome. They were far enough away that they probably thought I couldn't hear them over the music and conversation. "I'm telling you, Marcus," Uncle Kevin was saying, "you've done well for yourself. This house is beautiful. Mama Rose left y'all sitting pretty." "Yeah, well," Dad replied, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "It took some work to get everything situated properly, but we're good now." I paused in my tea making, curious about what he meant by situated properly. Uncle Jerome laughed. "Man, I still can't believe Zara was gonna let this place just sit here while she worked herself to death. Good thing you stepped in to handle the business side." "That's the thing about Zara," Dad said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, cold, calculated, almost dismissive. "She's always been a burden. Works hard, sure, but no head for business. No understanding of how the real world works." The pitcher slipped in my hands, and I almost dropped it. "A burden?" Uncle Kevin asked, sounding surprised. "Think about it," Dad continued, his voice gaining momentum like he was warming up to a familiar topic. "She's 26 years old, never been married, no kids, lives for that hospital job like it's some kind of calling. And now she thinks she deserves a mansion just because Mama Rose felt sorry for her. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. But she inherited it fair and square," Uncle Jerome pointed out. Dad laughed, and it was the coldest sound I'd ever heard from him. "Did she?" "See, that's the beautiful thing about having a daughter who trusts you completely. She signs whatever you put in front of her without reading it. Smart girl in some ways, but naive as hell when it comes to business." My hand started shaking. "What are you saying, Marcus?" Uncle Kevin's voice had dropped to a whisper. "I'm saying that legally speaking, this house belongs to Williams Family Properties LLC now. Has for about 8 months. Zara signed the quitclaim deed herself, along with all the other paperwork. She thinks she's still the owner, but she's really just a tenant. A tenant who pays all the bills." The laughter that followed felt like needles in my ears. "Marcus, that's..." Uncle Jerome started. "That's smart business," Dad interrupted. "Look, I tried to do this the right way. Asked her to add my name to the deed as co-owner, for family security purposes. She kept saying she needed to think about it and maybe talk to a lawyer. Like I'm some stranger trying to con her instead of her father who's been taking care of this property for 2 years. So you just took it?" Uncle Kevin asked. "I protected it. And her. Because in 5 years, when she's still single and still working herself to death, and some smooth-talking man comes along promising her the world, you think she won't be tempted to sell this place or put it up as collateral for his schemes? At least this way, the property stays in the family where it belongs." I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as I stood frozen in my own kitchen. "Besides," Dad continued, "she's getting a fair deal. Free housing, all her needs taken care of, family support. All she has to do is keep working and contributing to the household expenses. It's more than most landlords would offer." Landlord. He was talking about being my landlord in the house my grandmother left me. "And if she finds out?" Uncle Jerome asked. "Finds out what?" "That her family loves her enough to protect her from her own poor judgment. That we've secured her future instead of letting her make mistakes with valuable property." Dad's voice took on that patronizing tone I was starting to recognize. "Trust me, Zara's not going to question anything. She's too busy playing nurse to pay attention to business matters. And even if she did, what's she going to do? Take her own family to court? Make us homeless? She doesn't have it in her." "What about Denise and the kids?" Uncle Kevin asked. "What about them? They live here too. This is their home now. Zara's the one who invited us to move in, remember? She wanted family support, and that's what she got. We're all contributing to the household in our own ways. By contributing, you mean? Uncle Jerome prompted. I mean, I handle all the property management, maintenance, financial planning. Denise manages the household operations. The kids help with yard work and upkeep. And Zara, well, Zara keeps the money coming in. They all laughed again. Sounds like you've got it all figured out, Uncle Kevin said admiringly. I learned from watching my father's mistakes, Dad replied. He spent his whole life working for other people, never built anything lasting. I'm not making that error. This house is going to be our family's foundation for generations. Our family. Not my family. Their family. A family I apparently wasn't really part of anymore. Smart man, Uncle Jerome said. Zara's lucky to have you looking out for her interests. She is, Dad agreed. Even if she doesn't appreciate it yet. Someday she'll understand that everything I did was for her own good. I set the picture down on the counter with trembling hands and walked quietly upstairs to my bedroom, or what I'd thought was my bedroom in my house. I locked the door and sat on my bed, trying to process what I'd just heard. My father had stolen my house. Not through some complicated scheme I couldn't understand, but through simple betrayal of trust. He'd put papers in front of me, told me they were routine maintenance documents, and I'd signed away my inheritance without knowing it. But more than that, he'd planned it. This wasn't some opportunistic moment where he saw a chance and took it. This was a calculated, long-term strategy to steal everything my grandmother had left me while making me grateful for the privilege of paying all the bills. I was a tenant in my own home. A tenant whose rent was her entire paycheck and her complete trust in a father who saw her as nothing more than a burden to be managed. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything. If I was such a burden, maybe it was time to lift that weight from their shoulders permanently. But first, I needed to understand exactly what had been done to me. And then, I needed to figure out how to undo it. Because if there's one thing you learn working in an emergency room, it's that sometimes the only way to save someone's life is to cut out the thing that's killing them. Even when that thing is supposed to be family. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Not for them, they had no idea what was coming. But for me. Because sometimes, when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from, the only choice is to protect yourself. The first week after overhearing that conversation was the darkest of my life. I called in sick to work for 3 days straight, something I'd never done in my entire nursing career, because I couldn't trust myself to take care of patients when I could barely function. I kept replaying Dad's words in my head like a broken record. She's always been a burden. Naive as hell. She signs whatever you put in front of her. Each phrase hit me like a fresh wound, and I couldn't stop the bleeding. But the worst part wasn't the insults. It was the realization of how thoroughly I'd been played. Every loving gesture, every helpful suggestion, every time Dad had called me baby girl while handing me papers to sign, it had all been manipulation. He hadn't moved in to support me through grief. He'd moved in to execute a plan. I spent those first few days in a haze of disbelief and rage, alternating between crying fits and furious pacing around my room. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have trusted him so completely? How had I not seen what was happening right in front of me? By the 4th day, something shifted. The emotional devastation was still there, but my nursing training kicked in. In the ER, you learn to compartmentalize trauma so you can focus on solutions. You assess the damage, stop the bleeding, and create a treatment plan. I needed to assess the damage. That morning, while Dad was at a job site, and Denise had taken the kids shopping, I went into Dad's home office, the room that used to be Mama Rose's sewing room. My hands were shaking as I started going through the filing cabinets. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There were dozens of documents with my signature on them, all neatly organized in folders labeled Property Transfer, Business Formation, and Financial Management. I recognized my handwriting, but I had no memory of reading most of these papers. The quitclaim deed was there, transferring ownership from Zara Williams to Williams Family Properties LLC. My signature was clear and legal. According to the paperwork, I had willingly transferred ownership in exchange for ongoing residence and property management services. I felt sick. There were also loan documents. Dad had taken out a $200,000 home equity line of credit against the property, money I'd never seen. According to the bank statements hidden in another folder, most of it had been spent on his construction business and a new truck for Jamal. But the most devastating document was a rental agreement. Apparently, I was now paying $2,800 per month in rent to Williams Family Properties LLC for the privilege of living in my grandmother's house. All those household expenses I'd been struggling to cover. They weren't expenses. They were rent payments to my own father for living in my own home. I sat on the floor of that office, surrounded by evidence of my own financial execution, and realized I needed help. Professional help. The next morning, I called Patricia Chin, a family law attorney whose office was near the hospital. I'd seen her business cards in the break room and remembered thinking her tagline was interesting, protecting families from family. Ms. Williams, she said after I'd explained my situation, what you're describing sounds like elder abuse tactics applied to a younger person. Financial exploitation through abuse of trust and authority. But I signed everything willingly, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Did you know what you were signing? No. He told me they were insurance updates and tax documents. Then you didn't sign willingly. You signed under false pretenses, which could constitute fraud. For the first time in a week, I felt a spark of hope. What are my options? I asked. Patricia was direct and thorough. First, we need to determine if the transfers were legal despite the deception. Georgia law is specific about property fraud, but proving intent can be challenging when family members are involved. She paused, studying the documents I'd brought. However, the fact that he created an LLC specifically to receive the property, combined with the false representations about what you were signing, suggests premeditation. That could work in our favor. What would happen to him if we prove fraud? Property fraud involving amounts over $500 is a felony in Georgia. He could face prison time, restitution requirements, and criminal penalties. But Zara, you need to understand, pursuing this will likely destroy your relationship with your entire family permanently. I thought about Dad calling me a burden. About Denise redecorating my grandmother's house like it was hers. About paying rent to live in my own home while they lived there for free. My relationship with my family was destroyed the moment he decided to steal from me, I said. I just didn't know it yet. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia and I developed a strategy. The first step was getting a forensic accountant to trace all the financial transactions and document the full scope of the theft. The second step was filing complaints with both the police and the district attorney's office. But the most important step was the one Patricia suggested almost as an afterthought. Have you considered that if we can prove the property transfer was fraudulent, we can have it reversed? You could get your house back. And then what? I asked. Then you decide what to do with it. You could sell it, you could evict the current occupants, you could renovate it and rent it legitimately. It would be your choice. Your choice. I hadn't had a real choice about anything involving that house in 2 years. That night, I lay in bed listening to my family laughing and talking downstairs in what they thought was their home, planning what I now knew was my future. The girl who had trusted blindly was gone. The woman who remained was going to be much more careful about who she trusted. But first, she was going to take back what was stolen from her. I scheduled time off work, real time off, not sick days, and threw myself into building the case against my father. Every document, every bank statement, every email became evidence. Patricia introduced me to Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in white-collar family crimes. "This isn't uncommon," Detective Santos explained during our first meeting. "Family financial abuse is significantly underreported because victims often feel shame or loyalty conflicts. But what your father did was sophisticated and premeditated. This wasn't a moment of weakness, this was a long-term plan." As the evidence mounted, I realized that Dad's plan had been even more comprehensive than I'd initially understood. He'd been positioning himself as the property owner in all official records. The utility companies, insurance providers, and even the county tax office had him listed as the primary contact and owner. To the outside world, Marcus Williams owned that house. Zara Williams was just some woman who lived there. But the most chilling discovery came when we traced the LLC formation documents. Dad had filed the paperwork to create Williams Family Properties 6 months before Mama Rose died. He'd been planning to steal my inheritance before I'd even inherited it. That revelation killed any remaining doubt I had about my course of action. 3 weeks after my investigation began, Patricia called with news that would change everything. "Zara, I have a court date. We're filing for emergency relief to reverse the fraudulent property transfer. If the judge agrees with our evidence, you could have your house back within 30 days. And my father. The district attorney has reviewed the case. They're prepared to file criminal charges for theft by deception, forgery, and elder abuse." Elder abuse? I'm 26. Vulnerable adult abuse. You were grieving, isolated, and he exploited your trust and emotional state. Under Georgia law, that qualifies. I took a deep breath. How long before he finds out? The court papers will be served tomorrow morning. After that, everything happens very quickly. That night, I packed a bag and checked into a hotel. I wasn't going to be in that house when my father discovered that the burden he'd been trying to manage had just become his worst nightmare. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's letting the law handle people who think they're too smart to get caught. While they celebrated having successfully stolen my inheritance, I was quietly building a case that would make their theft look like the biggest mistake of their lives. And the beautiful part. They had no idea what was happening right under their noses. The next month was the most intense period of my life. While my family continued living in what they thought was their house, I was operating like a detective, gathering evidence and building an airtight case with Patricia's help. The forensic accountant we hired, David Kumar, was a former FBI financial crimes investigator who specialized in family fraud cases. What he discovered in just 2 weeks of analysis made my blood run cold. "Zara," he said during our meeting in Patricia's office, "your father didn't just steal your house. He's been systematically looting your grandmother's entire estate for 2 years. He spread out financial documents across the conference table like he was laying out evidence at a crime scene. The home equity loan was just the beginning. He's opened credit cards in the property's name, taken out business loans using the house as collateral, and even filed for property tax exemptions claiming financial hardship, while you were paying all the actual expenses." My hand started shaking as I looked at the numbers. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Conservatively. He's extracted about $340,000 in value from your property through various financial instruments. But here's the interesting part. Most of that money has gone into improvements and investments in other properties." David pulled out another set of documents. "Your father has been using your house as collateral to build his own real estate portfolio. He now owns 2 rental properties and a small commercial building, all purchased with loans secured by your inheritance." I felt like I was going to be sick. "So he didn't just steal my house to live in it," I said slowly. "He stole it to build his own empire." "Exactly. And the beauty of his scheme is that you've been paying for everything. The mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, even the loan payments on the money he borrowed against the property. You've been financing your own financial destruction. Patricia leaned forward. But this actually works in our favor. The more sophisticated the fraud, the more serious the criminal charges. And the fact that he's used your property to acquire other assets gives us multiple avenues for recovery. Over the next 2 weeks, we meticulously documented every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every illegal use of the property. Patricia filed a comprehensive lawsuit not just to recover my house, but to seize all the properties Dad had purchased with stolen equity. We're going after everything, she explained. If he used your house to buy other properties, then those properties are effectively stolen goods. We can force their sale and recover the proceeds. But the criminal case was what would really devastate him. Detective Santos had been building the criminal file simultaneously with our civil case. The evidence was overwhelming, dozens of forged documents, financial statements showing clear intent to defraud, and recorded conversations with his brothers that proved premeditation. The district attorney loves cases like this, Detective Santos told me. Clear evidence, sympathetic victim, sophisticated defendant who thought he was too smart to get caught. Your father is looking at multiple felony counts. What kind of sentence are we talking about? Given the amount of money involved and the sophistication of the scheme, probably 8 to 12 years in prison. Plus restitution, which could include forfeiture of any assets purchased with the stolen funds. As the legal machinery moved into place, I had to continue living the lie. I went back to work, came home to the house every evening, and sat through family dinners where Dad would talk about our plans for the property. The hardest part was watching Denise and my step-siblings, who I realized might have been unknowing accomplices in Dad's scheme. Jamal had just started his junior year of college, and Keisha was planning her wedding for the following summer. They were building their lives around the stability Dad had provided by stealing from me. But my sympathy only went so far. They'd been living rent-free in my house for 2 years while I struggled to pay bills. They'd participated in treating me like a guest in my own home. Maybe they hadn't known about the fraud, but they'd certainly enjoyed its benefits. 3 weeks before we were ready to serve the legal papers, I made a decision that Patricia initially argued against. I want to give Dad one chance to confess and make this right, I told her. Zara, that's incredibly risky. If you tip him off, he could destroy evidence, transfer assets, or even flee. I know. But I need to know if there's any part of my father left that feels guilt about what he's done to me. Patricia sighed. If you're determined to do this, we need to control the situation completely. You'll wear a wire, we'll have backup nearby, and you get one conversation. If he doesn't immediately agree to reverse everything, we proceed with the full prosecution. I agreed to her conditions. The conversation was scheduled for a Saturday morning when Denise and the kids would be out shopping. I told Dad I needed to discuss some financial concerns about the house, and he agreed to meet me in his office. I was wearing a recording device and had Patricia's team positioned outside. My phone was set to speed dial 911 if things went wrong. What's on your mind, baby girl? Dad asked as I sat down across from his desk, the desk where he'd planned my financial destruction. I've been reviewing some of the paperwork you've had me sign over the past 2 years, I said carefully. And I'm confused about a few things. His expression didn't change, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly. What kind of things? Like why there's a quitclaim deed with my signature transferring the house to an LLC I've never heard of. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. Finally, Dad leaned back in his chair and smiled, not the warm, fatherly smile I remembered from childhood, but something cold and calculating. Well, he said slowly, I guess it's time we had an adult conversation about family responsibility. Meaning that sometimes parents have to make hard decisions to protect their children from their own poor judgment. You're a good nurse, Zara, but you don't understand business. You don't understand investment. You don't understand how to build generational wealth. I stared at him, recording every word. So you stole my house to protect me from my own poor judgment. I secured your future. That house was going to sit here appreciating slowly while you worked yourself to death. Now it's generating income, building equity, creating opportunities for the whole family. What about my consent? What about my choice in how to use my own inheritance? Dad's expression hardened. Your grandmother left you that house because she felt sorry for you, not because she thought you were capable of managing it properly. I'm doing what she should have done, ensuring it benefits the family instead of just one person. There it was. Complete honesty. No remorse, no guilt, no acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong. So you're not going to reverse the transfers and return my property? Return it to what? So you can make emotional decisions about valuable real estate. So you can let some future boyfriend talk you into bad investments? Absolutely not. He leaned forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. You're still young, Zara. Someday you'll understand that everything I did was for your own good. I stood up calmly, turned off the recording device, and looked at my father for what I knew would be the last time. You're right about one thing, Dad. I am going to understand something today. I'm going to understand exactly what kind of man you really are. As I walked out of that office, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. I'd given him every opportunity to be the father I'd hoped he could be. Instead, he'd confirmed that he was exactly the criminal the evidence showed him to be. Now it was time to let the law handle what family loyalty couldn't. The first crack in Dad's confident facade happened when the sheriff's deputy knocked on the door at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was already at work, pulling an early shift, but Denise called me in a panic 20 minutes later. Zara, something's wrong, she said, her voice shaky. A deputy just served your father with some kind of court papers. He's been locked in his office for the past hour, and I can hear him making angry phone calls. What kind of court papers? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. I don't know. Something about property fraud and a lawsuit. He won't tell me what's going on, but he looks scared. Really scared. For the first time in months, I smiled. I'm sure it's just some business issue, I said. Dad's good at handling these things. But Dad wasn't good at handling these things. Because what he'd just received was a civil lawsuit demanding the immediate return of my property, plus a notice that the district attorney's office was filing criminal charges for theft by deception, forgery, and financial elder abuse. According to Patricia, who called me an hour later, the process server had also delivered a court order freezing all assets of Williams Family Properties LLC pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. How did he react? I asked. According to the deputy, he went white as a sheet and started demanding to know who filed the complaint. When the deputy told him it was confidential pending the investigation, he tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding. What happens now? Now we wait for his attorney to contact us. He has 72 hours to respond to the civil complaint, and the criminal charges will be filed on Thursday. I worked my entire shift with a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since overhearing that barbecue conversation, I felt like I had some control over my situation. When I got home that evening, the atmosphere in the house was electric with tension. Denise was bustling around the kitchen, stress cooking enough food to feed an army. Jamal and Keisha were both unusually quiet, huddled together on the couch whispering. And Dad was nowhere to be seen. Where's Dad? I asked Denise. Still in his office, she said without looking up from the pot she was stirring. He's been on the phone with lawyers all day. Lawyers? That sounds serious. Denise finally looked at me, and I could see the worry lines around her eyes. Zara, do you know anything about some kind of property dispute involving the house? I kept my expression carefully neutral. What kind of property dispute? I don't know. He won't tell me the details, but he keeps saying something about a family betrayal and how someone is trying to steal our home. Our home. Even now, facing legal consequences, Dad was still maintaining the fiction that this house belonged to all of us. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, I said, echoing the same phrase Dad had used with the deputy. These legal things usually work themselves out. But it wasn't working itself out. Over the next 3 days, Dad's panic became increasingly obvious. He spent hours on the phone with various attorneys, and I could hear his voice getting louder and more desperate with each conversation. What do you mean you can't make this disappear? I heard him shouting from his office Wednesday night. It's a family dispute. She's my daughter. On Thursday morning, Detective Santos called to inform me that the criminal charges had been officially filed. Dad would be arrested within 24 hours. Are you somewhere safe? She asked. I'm at work. Why? Because once he's processed and released on bail, he's going to know who filed the complaint. Make sure you're not alone with him until this is resolved. I thanked her and immediately called Patricia. I need to not be in that house when he gets arrested, I told her. Already arranged. I've booked you a hotel room for the week. Check in this afternoon and don't tell anyone where you're staying. That evening, I packed a bag while the family was at dinner and left quietly through the back door. I left a note on my bed saying I was staying with a friend for a few days because I had some personal things to work through. It wasn't entirely a lie. The arrest happened Friday morning at 6 a.m. Detective Santos called to let me know it had gone smoothly. He was shocked, she reported. Kept insisting it was all a misunderstanding and demanding to speak to you. He made bail within 4 hours. What happens next? He'll probably try to contact you. Don't answer. Let everything go through your attorney now. She was right. My phone started ringing at 11 a.m. and didn't stop for the rest of the day. Dad called 17 times. Denise called 12 times. Even Uncle Kevin called, demanding to know what was going on. I didn't answer any of them. But I did listen to the voicemails, and they told me everything I needed to know about how Dad was handling his new reality. The first few messages were angry and demanding. Zara, call me immediately. I don't know what kind of lies someone has been telling you, but this is ridiculous. We're family. Then they became pleading. Baby girl, please call me back. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I can explain everything if you'll just talk to me. By evening, they were desperate. Zara, they're saying I could go to prison. Prison. Over some paperwork confusion. You know I would never hurt you. You know everything I did was to protect our family. Please, you have to help me fix this. The final voicemail, left at nearly midnight, was the one that confirmed I'd made the right decision. This is all your fault, you ungrateful bitch. After everything I've done for you, after giving you a family, home, a place to belong, this is how you repay me. By destroying everything we've built. By trying to put your own father in prison. His mask had finally slipped completely. Saturday morning, Patricia called with an update that made everything worth it. The judge reviewed our emergency motion yesterday afternoon. Based on the evidence of fraud and the criminal charges, he's granted our request for immediate return of the property. What does that mean? It means the fraudulent property transfer has been legally voided. As of right now, you are once again the sole legal owner of your grandmother's house. I sat down hard on the hotel bed. And Dad. Marcus Williams and all other occupants have 30 days to vacate the premises. If they refuse, you can have them legally evicted. What about all the money he stole? That's where it gets interesting. The court has ordered the seizure and sale of all properties purchased with funds fraudulently obtained from your house. The proceeds will be used to pay restitution. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something that wasn't anger or hurt or determination. I felt justice. When do I tell them? I asked. You don't. The sheriff's department will serve the eviction notice on Monday morning. After that, it's all legal process. And then you decide what to do with your life and your property. Without anyone else's input or interference. Sunday night, sitting in that hotel room, I realized that the scared, trusting daughter who had signed papers without reading them was gone forever. The woman who remained was about to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. And this was just the beginning. By now, Dad's panic was becoming impossible to hide. People who knew our story were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. And I was ready to give them answers they'd never forget. The eviction notice was served Monday morning at 8 a.m. while I was safely at work. According to Patricia, who had someone monitoring the situation, Dad's reaction was everything we'd expected and more. He completely lost it, she reported during our phone call. Started screaming at the deputy about family betrayal and demanding to know where you were staying. Had to be physically restrained when he tried to grab the papers out of the officer's hands. The notice gave them 30 days to vacate, but also included an immediate restraining order preventing Dad from contacting me directly or through intermediaries. Any communication had to go through attorneys. How's the rest of the family handling it? I asked. From what our observer could see, Denise was crying, the kids looked shocked, and your father was ranting about fighting this in court. Can he fight it? With what? The evidence is overwhelming, and he's now facing criminal charges. No attorney is going to take this case without a substantial retainer, and the asset freeze means he doesn't have access to the money he stole. Over the next week, the facade Dad had carefully constructed began crumbling publicly. The criminal charges had made the local news, local construction company owner arrested for property fraud, and people were starting to connect the dots. Denise's sister called me at work, somehow getting through to the nurse's station. Zara, I don't understand what's happening, she said, her voice desperate. Denise is saying you're trying to put Marcus in prison and make them homeless. That can't be true, can it? I'm not making anyone homeless, I replied carefully. I'm simply reclaiming ownership of my own property. But they've been living there for years. It's their home. It's my home. That they've been living in rent-free while I paid all the expenses. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I didn't know that, she finally said. Most people didn't. That was the point. The community grapevine was working overtime. My phone started getting calls from neighbors, acquaintances, even people I barely knew who had heard various versions of the story. Mrs. Patterson from next door left a voicemail expressing her shock. Honey, I had no idea that house was yours. Your father always acted like he owned it. He even had business cards printed with that address listing him as the property owner. That detail stung more than I expected. Dad hadn't just stolen my house, he'd been using it to promote his business, literally profiting from my grandmother's legacy while pretending it was his achievement. But the call that really got to me came from Jamal. He somehow got my new cell number and called me Thursday evening while I was having dinner at the hotel. Zara, please, he said, his voice breaking. I know you're mad at Dad, but please don't do this to us. Keisha had to postpone her wedding because we can't afford the deposits anymore. I might have to drop out of school. My heart clenched. Despite everything, I did care about my step-siblings. Jamal, I'm not doing anything to you. Your father stole my house and used it to finance his lifestyle. The consequences of that are his responsibility, not mine. But where are we supposed to go? We don't have anywhere else to live. Your father should have thought about that before he committed multiple felonies. You could drop the charges, he pleaded. You could let us work out some kind of payment plan. We're family. Family doesn't steal from each other, Jamal. Family doesn't call each other burdens while plotting to take everything they own. I could hear him crying. I'm sorry, I said softly. I really am. But I can't set myself on fire to keep you warm anymore. Meanwhile, Dad's legal situation was deteriorating rapidly. Patricia informed me that he tried to hire 3 different attorneys, but none would take the case without a substantial upfront payment. The 4th attorney he contacted called me directly, she said with obvious satisfaction. Apparently your father offered to sign over one of his rental properties as payment, not realizing that those properties are also subject to seizure. So he has no legal representation. He's going to have to use a public defender for the criminal case, and he's representing himself in the civil matter. Which is exactly what we want. 2 weeks before the eviction deadline, Dad made a desperate move that confirmed everything I'd believed about his character. He tried to sell the house. He actually called a real estate agent and tried to list the property, Patricia told me, laughing. Claimed he was the owner and needed a quick sale. The agent did a title search and called us when she discovered the fraud case. What happens now? Now she's a witness in our case. And your father has added attempted sale of stolen property to his list of crimes. The final straw came when Dad apparently tried to take out another loan against the property, not realizing it was no longer legally his. The lender flagged it as potential fraud and reported it to the authorities, Detective Santos informed me. He's looking at additional charges now. As the 30-day deadline approached, I realized that Dad still didn't understand the magnitude of what was about to happen to him. He was about to lose everything, his home, his business properties, his freedom, and his family. And it was all because he'd called his own daughter a burden while stealing her inheritance. The gathering storm was about to become a Category 5 hurricane. And Dad was standing directly in its path. The day I walked back into my grandmother's house knowing what was about to happen, I felt a calm I'd never experienced before. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about justice. And justice was about to be served with surgical precision. The eviction was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I arrived at 9:45 with Patricia, Detective Santos, and a sheriff's deputy, standing on the front porch of the house that had been stolen from me and was now legally mine again. Through the front window, I could see boxes stacked in the living room. At least they were packing. The deputy knocked firmly on the door. Sheriff's Department. Open up, please. Dad opened the door himself, and when he saw me standing behind the officers, his face went through a range of emotions, surprise, hurt, and finally, cold fury. So this is how you want to do this, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. With cops and lawyers. Instead of talking to your family like an adult. Mr. Williams, the deputy interrupted, you were served with legal eviction papers 2 weeks ago. This is the deadline for vacating the premises. This is my home, Dad said, his voice rising. I've lived here for 3 years. I've put thousands of dollars into improvements. You can't just throw us out on the street. Actually, Patricia stepped forward, we can. Because this was never your home. It was stolen property that you've been illegally occupying. Denise appeared behind Dad, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Zara, please. We have nowhere to go. The kids are in school. Keisha's wedding is next month. You had 30 days to make arrangements, I said, my voice steady. The same 30 days you could have used to confess and try to make this right. Make what right? Dad exploded. Taking care of you. Providing you with a stable home. Managing property you were too naive to handle properly. The deputy's hand moved to his radio. Sir, I need you to lower your voice and step back. But Dad was beyond reason now. 3 weeks of legal pressure, criminal charges, and public humiliation had finally broken his careful facade. You want to know the truth? He shouted, pointing at me. You were a burden. A 23-year-old crying baby who couldn't handle basic adult responsibilities after your grandmother died. We moved in here to help you, and this is how you repay us. By stealing my inheritance and calling me a burden at family gatherings. I replied calmly. Dad's face went white. He'd forgotten about the recording. You were listening, he said quietly. I was accidentally included in a conversation where you bragged about defrauding me, called me a burden, and laughed about how easy it was to manipulate me into signing away my own property. I pulled out my phone and played back his own words. She's always been a burden. She signs whatever you put in front of her without reading it. Smart girl in some ways, but naive as hell when it comes to business. Denise gasped. Marcus, what is she talking about? Dad's jaw worked silently for a moment before he made the worst decision possible. So what? He said defiantly. Everything I said was true. You were a burden. You couldn't handle this property. You needed someone to make adult decisions for you. The deputy was now taking notes. And taking her house without her knowledge was making an adult decision. Patricia asked. I was protecting family assets from her poor judgment. That house would have been sold or mortgaged for some ridiculous idea within 5 years. At least this way it stayed in the family. Whose family? I asked. Because you made it very clear at that barbecue that I wasn't really part of your family. I was just someone to be managed and manipulated. Detective Santos stepped forward. Mr. Williams, you should know that everything you're saying right now is being recorded and can be used in your criminal trial. That finally shut him up. We need to proceed with the eviction, the deputy announced. You have 2 hours to remove your personal belongings. Anything left after that becomes the property owner's responsibility. Asterisk 2 hours. Denise cried. We can't pack 3 years of our lives in 2 hours. You've had 30 days, Patricia replied. The court order is very specific. As we waited outside while they gathered their belongings, I watched through the windows as my family dismantled the life they'd built in my house. Denise was crying while she wrapped dishes. Jamal and Keisha moved like zombies, carrying boxes to their cars. And Dad. Dad stood in his office, Mama Rose's former sewing room, staring at the walls like he couldn't believe this was happening. After 2 hours, the deputy announced time was up. The family emerged from the house carrying the last of their possessions, looking like refugees from their own lives. Dad stopped in front of me as he carried a box to his truck. I hope you're proud of yourself, he said, his voice full of venom. Destroying your own family over money. I didn't destroy anything, I replied. I just stopped pretending that theft was love. You'll regret this, he said. When you're sitting alone in that big empty house with no family, no support, nothing but your precious property, you'll realize what you've lost. What I've lost is a father who saw me as a resource to be exploited instead of a daughter to be loved. I'm not sure that's much of a loss. Denise approached me as Dad loaded the truck. Zara, I need you to know, I didn't know about the fraud. I thought the house really was his. I looked at her for a long moment. But you knew I was paying all the bills while you lived here rent-free. You knew I was working 60-hour weeks to support a household of 5 adults. And you never once asked if that was fair. She had no answer for that. What happens to us now? She asked quietly. That's not my responsibility to figure out anymore. As their truck pulled away, Detective Santos approached me with papers. The warrant for the additional charges was approved this morning, she said. Attempted sale of stolen property and attempted loan fraud. We'll be arresting him again within 24 hours. How long will he get? With all the charges combined, he's looking at 12 to 15 years. The DA is particularly interested in making an example of family financial fraud cases. I nodded, feeling strangely empty. Patricia handed me the keys to my own front door. It's officially yours again. The title has been cleared, and all the fraudulent liens have been removed. I stood on the porch where I'd spent so many evenings with Mama Rose, looking out at the yard where she'd taught me to garden. The house felt different now, not just because it was empty, but because it was truly mine for the first time in 3 years. But the moment that made everything worth it came 2 days later. Dad was arrested again while trying to meet with a potential buyer for one of his rental properties, a property purchased with money stolen from me. According to Detective Santos, he was in the middle of forging documents when the FBI arrived. He actually tried to run, she told me with obvious satisfaction. Made it about 50 feet before they tackled him in the parking lot. The local news ran the story with the headline, "Construction company owner arrested again in ongoing property fraud case." The reporter mentioned that this was his second arrest in connection with stealing a house from his own daughter. That evening, I sat in Mama Rose's kitchen, my kitchen, reading the article on my laptop. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Dad in handcuffs being led to a police car, sent by someone who recognized me from the news coverage. Below the photo was a message, "Heard this was your dad. Karma's a bitch, isn't it?" I deleted the message without responding. This wasn't about karma or revenge anymore. This was about a man who had called his daughter a burden, discovering that burdens can fight back. And sometimes, when they fight back, they win. The next morning, I woke up in my own house, in my own bed, surrounded by silence that felt like freedom. For the first time in 3 years, I was home. Really, truly home. And Dad was waking up in a jail cell, finally understanding what it felt like to lose everything. Just like he'd planned to do to me. In the silence that followed, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about proving my father wrong, it was about proving to myself that I was never the burden he claimed I was. His inability to see my worth was his limitation, not my reality. The first few days alone in the house were surreal. I walked through rooms that had been occupied by my family for 3 years, seeing them empty for the first time since Mama Rose died. Without their belongings, their noise, their constant presence, the house felt like it was breathing again. I found things they'd left behind, family photos tucked behind furniture, Denise's reading glasses on the kitchen windowsill, one of Jamal's textbooks forgotten under the couch. Physical evidence of lives that had been built on the foundation of my stolen inheritance. The hardest discovery was in Dad's former office. He'd left behind a folder labeled Property Management that contained all the documents related to his fraud scheme. Looking through them, I realized the theft had been even more systematic than I'd known. He'd kept meticulous records of every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every penny he'd stolen. It was like finding a criminal's confession written in his own handwriting. But mixed in with the fraud documents were family photos, pictures of all of us together during holidays, barbecues, family dinners. Images of what had looked like happiness but had really been a carefully staged performance. I sat on the floor of that empty office, surrounded by evidence of my father's crimes and memories of what I'd thought was love, and cried. Not for him, but for the father I'd thought he was. For the family I'd believed we were. For the daughter who had trusted so completely that she'd signed away her future without reading the fine print. The next week brought a flood of legal updates. Patricia called with news that felt like emotional whiplash. "The DA has offered your father a plea deal," she said during our phone call. "What kind of deal?" 7 years in prison, full restitution for all stolen funds, and forfeiture of the properties purchased with your money. In exchange, he pleads guilty to all charges and doesn't contest the asset seizure. Will he take it? His public defender is strongly recommending it. If he goes to trial and loses, he's looking at 15 to 20 years. 7 years. My father would be in prison for 7 years because he'd called me a burden and decided to steal my inheritance. How do you feel about that? Patricia asked. Relieved, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. I don't want him to destroy his entire life, but I also can't let him get away with what he did. The restitution process revealed the full scope of Dad's theft. The forensic accountant's final report showed he'd extracted nearly $400,000 from my property through various schemes. But the sale of his fraudulently purchased properties would recover almost all of it. You're actually going to come out ahead financially, Patricia explained. The properties he bought have appreciated in value. It felt like cosmic justice, but it didn't feel like victory. 3 weeks after the eviction, I got an unexpected call from Keisha. Zara. Her voice was small, uncertain. Can we talk? I'm listening. I wanted to apologize. And to thank you. That surprised me. Thank me. For not including me and Jamal in the criminal charges. Your lawyer told our attorney that you specifically requested we be treated as unknowing beneficiaries rather than accomplices. I had made that request, though I wasn't sure why at the time. You didn't know what Dad was doing, I said. It didn't seem fair to punish you for his crimes. But we benefited from them. We lived in your house rent-free for 3 years while you paid for everything. We should have questioned that. Her honesty surprised me. I've been thinking about all the times Dad would brag about his house and his property, she continued. We just accepted it because it benefited us. That was wrong. What will you do now? Jamal and I are moving in with our mom in Atlanta. I'm postponing the wedding until we can afford it ourselves. And I'm going back to school to finish my degree. That sounds like a good plan. Zara. I know we can't be family anymore, not after what Dad did. But I want you to know that I always looked up to you. The way you worked so hard, the way you took care of everyone. I'm sorry we took advantage of that. After we hung up, I realized that conversation had given me something I didn't know I needed, acknowledgement that my sacrifices had been real, that the unfairness had been visible to others, and that my decision to fight back had been justified. A month after reclaiming my house, I made a decision that felt both practical and symbolic. I put it on the market. Are you sure? Patricia asked when I told her. This house represents your family history, your grandmother's legacy. My grandmother's legacy isn't a building, I replied. It's the strength she gave me to stand up for myself when everyone else had written me off. The house sold within 2 weeks for $1.4 million to $200,000 more than Dad had ever dreamed it was worth. With the proceeds, I bought a smaller house across town. Nothing grand or impressive, just a comfortable place that was entirely mine from the moment I signed the papers. As I sat in my new living room, surrounded by boxes and planning my actual future for the first time in years, I thought about Dad's final words to me, "You'll regret this when you're sitting alone in that big empty house with no family." He'd been wrong about almost everything, but especially about that. I wasn't alone. I had colleagues who respected me, friends who actually cared about my well-being, and a future that belonged entirely to me. And most importantly, I had something Dad had tried to take away, the knowledge of my own worth. The burden he tried to make me carry was finally gone. Not because I'd shifted it to someone else, but because I'd learned it was never mine to carry in the first place. Success, I learned, isn't just about proving people wrong. It's about building a life so fulfilling that their opinions become irrelevant background noise. 6 months after Dad was sentenced to 7 years in prison, I was living a life I'd never imagined possible. My new house was smaller than Mama Rose's colonial, but every square inch belonged to me. No one could take it, manipulate me out of it, or make me feel guilty for enjoying it. The financial restitution had left me in an unexpectedly strong position. After paying off my student loans and investing most of the recovered money, I had something I'd never experienced, true financial security. But the most profound change wasn't financial, it was psychological. For the first time in my adult life, I made decisions without considering how they might affect other people's comfort or convenience. I redecorated my entire house in colors I loved, not colors that would please potential guests. I bought furniture that made me happy, not pieces that would impress visitors. I even made a career change that shocked everyone who knew me. "You're leaving nursing?" my supervisor at the hospital asked when I submitted my resignation. "Zara, you're one of our best nurses. Where are you going?" "I'm starting a consulting business," I told her. "Helping people who've been victims of family financial abuse." The idea had come to me during one of my therapy sessions with Dr. Palmer, the counselor Patricia had recommended. We'd been discussing how many people suffer in silence when family members exploit them financially. There are resources for domestic violence, elder abuse, even financial scams, I'd said during one session. But what about adult children whose parents steal from them? What about siblings who manipulate each other out of inheritances? Where do those people go for help? Dr. Palmer had smiled. Maybe they could come to someone who understands exactly what they've been through. Within 3 months, I'd established Williams Financial Recovery Services, specializing in family financial abuse cases. The name was intentional. I was reclaiming the Williams identity from the man who tried to use it to steal from me. My first client was a woman whose brother had convinced her to sign over her half of their parents' house, then refused to let her live there. My second was a man whose wife had been draining his inheritance to support her gambling addiction while telling him they were investing in their future. Each case reminded me that Dad's behavior wasn't unique. Financial abuse within families was common, devastating, and largely invisible to outsiders. The business grew faster than I'd expected. Word spread through legal networks, therapy practices, and support groups. Within a year, I was working with clients across 3 states, helping them document abuse, recover stolen assets, and rebuild their financial lives. But the case that meant the most to me came from an unexpected source. Jamal called me 18 months after the eviction. He was 21 now, working full-time while finishing college, and he discovered that Dad had also stolen from him. He opened credit cards in my name when I was 17, Jamal explained during our meeting. Maxed them out and never paid them. My credit is destroyed, and I'm being sued for debts I didn't even know existed. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. That must have been devastating to discover. "I understand now why you did what you did," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry we ever called you selfish for protecting yourself." Helping Jamal recover from Dad's financial abuse and rebuild his credit gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. It also reinforced that my decision to fight back hadn't just protected me, it had exposed a pattern of behavior that needed to be stopped. The consulting business also led to something I'd never anticipated, a relationship. David Kumar, the forensic accountant who'd helped with my case, referred several clients to me over the months. During one of our professional collaborations, he asked me to dinner. "Is this a business dinner?" I asked. "No," he said with a smile. "This is me asking someone I admire to spend time with me outside of work." David understood financial abuse in ways that most people couldn't. He'd seen the patterns, the manipulation tactics, the psychological damage it caused. He never questioned my hypervigilance about financial documents or my insistence on maintaining separate bank accounts. "Trust has to be earned back slowly," he said one evening as we reviewed a prenup agreement, my idea, not his. "And I'm willing to earn it at whatever pace feels safe for you." 6 months into our relationship, he proved that by doing something that stunned me. He suggested we create a joint account where we'd each contribute equally to shared expenses, while maintaining complete independence over our individual finances. "This isn't about combining resources," he explained. "It's about showing transparency in shared responsibilities." It was the opposite of everything Dad had done, honest, transparent, and designed to protect rather than exploit. As I settled into my new life, I realized that Dad had been wrong about everything except one thing: I was alone in my house. But alone didn't mean lonely. Alone meant free. If you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, remember this: your worth isn't determined by people who call you a burden. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is underestimating you, because it forces you to prove just how strong you really are. It's been 3 years since I walked back into my grandmother's house as its rightful owner. 3 years since I learned that being called a burden was really my father's confession of his own inadequacy. 3 years since I discovered that sometimes the people who claim to protect you are actually the ones you need protection from. Dad will be eligible for parole in 4 more years. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, and honestly, I'm okay with that uncertainty. What I do know is that my consulting business has helped over 200 families recover from financial abuse. I've testified before state legislators about the need for stronger protections against family financial fraud. And I've built a life where no one can ever call me a burden again, because I've learned not to carry weight that isn't mine. The house where it all started. It's now owned by a young family with 2 little girls. Sometimes I drive by and see them playing in Mama Rose's garden, and I smile knowing that house is filled with genuine love again. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're the family disappointment, the one being financially manipulated, the person everyone takes advantage of because you're family, understand this. Their inability to see your worth is not evidence of your worthlessness. It's evidence of their blindness. You don't owe anyone your financial security just because you share DNA. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. And you definitely don't have to accept being called a burden by people who are actually burdening you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for toxic family members is to stop enabling their behavior and let them face the consequences of their choices. My name is Zara Williams, and 3 years ago, my father called me a burden while stealing my inheritance. Today, I run a $1 million business helping other people escape the same kind of abuse. The burden he tried to make me carry. I lifted it off my shoulders and dropped it right back where it belonged, on his. Thanks for taking this journey with me. Drop a comment about your own experiences with family financial abuse, smash that like button if this story gave you courage to protect yourself, and subscribe for more stories about turning your biggest betrayals into your greatest victories. Because sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up giving you exactly the motivation you need to build something beautiful. And that's the best revenge of all.